Hello, my name is Heather Hughes and I work in the Department of Marketing, Languages and Tourism at the University of Lincoln, where I am a professor of cultural heritage studies and I do a lot of teaching on cultural heritage, including on cultural heritage tourism. And I've chosen today to talk to you about a phenomenon that particularly affects cultural heritage destinations in the world today, and the phenomenon is called overtourism. I've chosen to talk to you about one problem that the world actually doesn't have right at the moment, because we're all under lockdown. Most of the historic cities and cultural heritage destinations in the world are completely empty of tourists. So why have I chosen to talk about a problem we don't have? I think largely because it's a problem that was growing worse and worse before lockdown, and all of our investigations tend to suggest it's going to come back. People are so desperate, I think, to get back to some elements of normality that many destinations, once they reopen, will once again be grappling with this problem of over-tourism. So what is it? It's pretty suggestive of the term itself, over-tourism. It's quite a new term. In fact, it's so new that my spell checker doesn't like it at all. But scholars and researchers tend to use it quite a lot now to refer to a phenomenon of, simply put, too many tourists in particular kinds of spaces. Congestion becomes a problem, crowding, littering, queuing, tourists vastly outnumbering residents in particular places, residents feeling very scratchy and negative about tourists, the disappearance of many local services, and they're replaced with tourist services, which causes more resentment, and basically a destination getting into the news for all the wrong reasons. Now, I'm going to use Venice as a case study for today's discussion. And in the year before lockdown, Venice got into the news an awful lot, and all the news was negative. For example, an enormous cruise ship crashing into a small tourist boat, tourists fined for bad behavior, a historic city really struggling with climate change and more frequent flooding, Venice literally under siege from the environment and from tourists. And one of the things I think I want to stress is that the environmental problems and the tourist problems in Venice are closely connected. So before we go on to look at this issue of over-tourism, what and where is Venice? Some of you have probably visited yourselves, and I've been over the years. I've taken students on study visits, and I've done research with colleagues, because there are two wonderful universities actually in the historic centre of Venice. It's a series of islands in a lagoon right at the top of the Adriatic Sea off the coast of northeast Italy. From the air, when you look at Venice, it's fish-shaped, which I always think is incredibly fitting for a city that is so closely connected to the sea. It's very old, Venice, dating back 1500 years or more. Most of the buildings that you see in Venice today are well over half a century old. Venice became vastly wealthy in times gone by, based on its role in long-distance trade on the high seas between East and West, trading in all kinds of precious commodities. Marco Polo, the famous explorer, came from Venice. You can still see so many of the sumptuous palaces and churches that were built on the back of that wealth, and you can still visit the cathedral, which quite literally is lined with gold. It really is a very special city in many ways. It's a city built on the series of small islands. I think there are about 120 of them, and platforms that are resting on top of log piles that are driven into the seabed. And this particularly strange basis to the city of Venice, the foundation of Venice, means that it's crisscrossed with canals and footbridges. You can wander around little lanes, you can come across tiny little squares, and then suddenly you come out onto a vast piazza. It's a very layered and complex place, Venice. I know that this is a talk about tourism rather than literature, but there isn't another city in the world about which so many books, novels, poems, plays, and films have been produced. I'm going to just, for example, talk about one of those. It's a book of short stories by a wonderful Italian writer called Italo Calvino. And it's a book called Invisible Cities. And these are dreamed up cities. So each city has a very short little story about it. And they're all, as I say, dreamed up. And there's one called Thin Cities. There's one called The Trading Cities. There's one called Cities in the Dead, Cities in the Sky, Continuous Cities, Hidden Cities. You get the drift. But the key thing about all of these cities is that they really all are Venice. It's a very, very amazing place. It really, I think, does get under your skin. Because of Venice's strange foundation on the series of islands, of course, there are no cars in Venice. You can't get around by car. Trains, buses, cars all come across a causeway from the mainland, and then they stop right on the edge of Venice. And after that, you have to walk, or you can get water transport, water buses, and so on. So it's a very strange place. Even the police move around in water boats. Venice over the last century has had increasing problems with flooding, which is damaging a lot of those very ancient structures in the city. And some very radical proposals have been made in recent years, and very radical solutions to cope with flooding in Venice. And you might want to investigate the key one, which is a system of barriers that are being constructed across the outlets of the Venice Lagoon to stop water actually coming in when there are very high tides. It's been one of the most expensive infrastructural projects in Europe in recent years, and it is quite dramatic to see these barriers coming up out of the water and then closing down again. And each of them is the size of a house. So it's an extraordinary piece of engineering to try to hold back the Adriatic Sea. But before we come to talking more about the water, let's talk about the visitors and how people are also flooding Venice. Venice gets something like 28 million tourists a year, or at least did until March 2020. That's around 76,000 a day, which for a very small city is an awful lot of tourists. Not many of them, interestingly, stay overnight, so they don't bring a lot of benefit to the residents of Venice. They come for, many of them are day trippers. Many of them arrive on huge, towering cruise ships. Some people call them floating Alps. And they're a real problem for Venice because those enormous cruise ships are causing enormous damage to the Venice Lagoon. And that in that way, I think you can see how these problems, environmental and social, are connected. And again, these large numbers of tourists decant off the cruise ships into Venice, spend a few hours in the city, and then are off on their cruise ship somewhere else again. And although one can understand why this is so bad for Venice and the environment, one can also understand why these tours are so popular. Because arriving in a place like Venice from the sea, from these quite high vantage points, is really truly beautiful sight. You can look on YouTube, for example, and see clips of tourist footage arriving in Venice by sea, and it is a very spectacular sight. So one can understand why it's popular. This is one of the phenomena, one of the components, I think, of over-tourism, is that not a lot of the benefits of tourism remain in the destination. So although this is a very, the amount of tourism in Venice generates a lot of income, it's not necessarily for the people of Venice. Why does the problem go on if it's so bad? Part of the problem is that there just has not been any joined up thinking about Venice between the local authorities, the regional authorities, the national authorities. They've tended to squabble and fight about what the solutions might be. And there are very huge vested interests. Of course, the cruise industry wants the cruise industry to continue. And there are lots of people who are less powerful who don't want it to continue. UNESCO, the problem got so bad in Venice that UNESCO threatened to withdraw its status as a World Heritage Site, which is, things have to get quite bad for that to occur. Another phenomenon associated with over-tourism is that residents don't feel as if they benefit at all from these vast numbers of visitors coming into their city. So it may be a surprise to know that the population of Venice has now dropped below 60,000. So on any day of the year, again, until lockdown, there were more tourists than residents in Venice. Because people find it very hard to survive there. Accommodation becomes more expensive, services are hard to find, and there's only so much Vivaldi that you can listen to if you want to go to a live music concert. And that's the only thing really that the live music venues put on, because it's music that tourists like to hear. So a lot of the people who work in Venice now have relocated from the historic city centre, and they live in one of the areas of Greater Venice on the mainland and have to commute backwards and forwards to work every day. So you can understand that there's quite a lot of tension as well between local residents and tourists. These are all the signs of over-tourism. What can be done about all of this? That is the key question. And these are the sorts of issues that we set our students to grapple with. We talk a lot in our tourism courses about sustainable tourism. Over-tourism is really a very good example of something which is completely opposite to sustainable tourism. So what would sustainable tourism look like in a place like Venice? For a start, I think it would mean some very, very tough choices about cruise liners. And in fact, there are signs of hope for when Venice reopens for visitors. Incidentally, residents have really enjoyed their city, having their city to themselves over the last year. But of course, they've missed the income and the revenue as well. But there are signs that the authorities have used this period of calm to reflect on how things should be in the future. So a small gain has been the decision that cruise ships will now have to call at a port on the mainland and people will have to travel around the mainland and onto Venice either by train or bus in future, so that the big, huge cruise liners won't be approaching so close to the historic city itself, and they won't therefore dominate the skyline as they did before. There is still a contest going on as to restricting the size of cruise liners that should be allowed into the Venice lagoon, and there are some hopeful signs that maybe that will be resolved as well. There is talk of imposing a tourist tax on all of those who come onto Venice, so that there is more revenue from tourism to support local residents and the services and facilities that they really need if Venice is to remain a living city. Another factor making for sustainable tourism is that residents' own needs and wants should feature so much more prominently in tourism development than they have done in a city like Venice up to now. And the environment needs to be taken more care of too. So it's not just about people, it's about trying to achieve some sort of harmonious balance. And if we don't achieve that for Venice, if all of the authorities who are responsible and can make the important changes don't make those changes, what will happen to Venice is that it will be a city with nobody living in it, and it will be a bit like a poorly run theme park, and nobody really wants that outcome. So I think that, we try to encourage students to think about how they might support a more sustainable outcome, not only in Venice, but in all the destinations that we study in our tourism courses. And I hope that gave you some pause for thought as well about what kind of tourism you would be prepared to support and to participate in. Thank you very much.